Good afternoon and welcome to today's Adweek webinar, 3 hidden client satisfaction opportunities you're probably missing and what to do about it. I'm Caroline Cakebread, Senior Editor of Adweek's Content Studio, and I'm going to be your host for today's presentation. Before we get started, I want to take a few moments to make sure everyone in our audience is comfortable with our platform and knows what to expect from today's presentation. Today's presentation should go in the 25-minute range, after which we'll have time for audience Q&A. So if at any point you have a question for today's speaker, please ask it using the question tool on the left side of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can after the end of our formal presentation. It's not too late to invite your colleagues to join us. About 15 minutes ago, you should have received a final reminder email from us, and there you'll find a link to the webinar registration page that you can share with your colleagues. There's still plenty of time for them to join us live, but if they can't, today's webinar is being recorded and they can catch the on-demand version later this afternoon. Today's slides are also available in the Event Resources tab, so check those out if you'd like a copy. And finally, if you enjoyed today's webinar, we urge you to check out the Adweek webinars calendar at adweek.com/webinars. You'll see what we have coming up and also get access to our archive of on-demand webinars. So now let me take a moment to introduce you to today's speaker. We are really excited to be joined by Mike Puter, CMO of Ziflow. So Mike, I will pass it over to you to kick off today's presentation.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I really appreciate it. I'm excited to talk to you about these 3 hidden client satisfaction tactics that you can use to create even greater client satisfaction. As Caroline mentioned, my name is Mike Puterbaugh. I'm the CMO here at Ziflow. I joined Ziflow very early on in the early days of Ziflow. I was actually the first US employee, believe it or not. I worked with the founding team here at Ziflow before at a company called Proof HQ, which was the leader of for online proofing at its time of its acquisition by Workfront, which is now Adobe. I may have spoken with some of you before. I've spoken at other conferences such as Martech, Adobe Max, How Design, and a couple Gartner conferences over my many years. I have been around for a while. I've led marketing teams in not only the Martech space, but also InfoSec and IT infrastructure. And I'm based in San Diego, California. So if you're ever in San Diego, let me know. Love to meet you for, now that we've opened back up in California, I'd love to meet for a coffee and talk about, all things great in MarTech. Well, now that I'm done with my vanity slide, I can actually, as I just locked my computer, sorry, I can move on to the content of today's call. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. When it comes to client satisfaction, and for this discussion, I'll be using satisfaction and happiness interchangeably a lot. So just keep that in mind. For client satisfaction, the single most important barometer of your business's health, it is client satisfaction. And for those in the brand world on this call, this applies to you as well, as your customers and clients are your internal colleagues, are also who should derive a lot of delight from your work. So, things like billings growth, referral business, and awards, they all align to client satisfaction. However, I would probably consider them mostly lagging indicators. As far as your leading indicators are concerned, I'm sure many of you were leveraging tools like NPS or customer sat surveys. And if those scores aren't budging after projects or on your quarterly reviews, it's probably time to try out some new tactics to improve your client's happiness. So that takes us into the 3 focus areas for today's discussion. And within each, we'll be talking about tactics for improving that satisfaction. So the first area that we're going to talk about today is communication standards. And not necessarily just what information, but also how it's being conveyed. And we'll talk through that in just a second. Second is client and project visibility, which probably just caused a kind of an involuntary cringe reaction from a lot of us on this call. Maybe giving project visibility isn't maybe the best thing, or you think it may open up a can of worms, but it definitely is something that is useful for client satisfaction. And then lastly, response and resolution. And what we're going to talk about here is ways to accelerate response times, but also create more comfort around the idea of action on both sides of the agency-client relationship. And again, this applies to brands as well. So let's jump in. As I said, the first thing we're going to talk about is communication standards. And this often comes down to not only cadence, but also context as well. So What I wanted to start with is a couple of stats from a survey we here at Ziflow commissioned earlier this year. And what we wanted to look at was how creative teams in both agencies and brands were spending their time. And what we found among a whole myriad of amazing stats was that over a full workday per week, that's 9 hours, was just spent on clarifying next steps. So that's confirming things such as feedback, handoffs, where something was to be routed, when something was to be routed, etc. And we also found that 2 hours were spent at the end of a project, or maybe even it was even the end of a version, chasing approvals, simply chasing approvals. And 2 hours may not seem like a lot, but that's per project, actually. I want to make sure I identify that as part of this stat. That's per project. So how many projects are you working on per week, and multiply that by 2 hours? Your mileage may vary as far as some of these stats are concerned, but what that really tells me is that this back and forth and waiting and sometimes ambiguity is frustrating on both sides of the agency-client relationship. And it kind of can often create an image of disorganization from the outside, whether or not that's true. So why does this happen? The primary problem is really due to how and what we're communicating. There's a huge over-reliance on email. We talk about this every day. And, when we talk to customers and people who are coming in and wanting to learn more about Ziflow, we talk probably the most about, email, and how there's still just this huge over-reliance on email for project updates, new version updates, clarifications, questions back and forth, sharing of files and briefs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these emails, let's talk tactically about email for a second, but these emails are just going into a folder to die, or they're in an email thread that just seems like it's never ending. And it's really hard to parse information out, and people become desensitized. And we're going to talk about that as well. But, email just is really, a lot of times, as obvious as it sounds, the primary culprit for communication issues within the agency-client relationship. And a lot of this comes down to information overload or desensitization on the client side, because they either get not enough information, that they don't know what to do with what they get in the small trickle of information, or the converse, the flip side, which is way too much information, like an hourly digest, which is just totally overkill for certain situations. And we're going to talk about the situations in just a sec. But as you can see, sometimes with notifications or updates, it's either a choice. It's often a choice between crickets or just, your head exploding with so much content being sent your way. And not the creative content I'm talking about. I'm talking about like update content. So let's talk about a few ways that you can try and, try out some new tactics to increase your client satisfaction. So this is kind of the first, you'll see that we've got a little bit of a template here for the slide. So when you see the happy faces, that's, when to start taking notes. So first, I would say get an agreement with your clients. And again, this could be internal or external. Get an agreement with your clients early on the cadence and context of your work in progress updates. What you want to do is you want to get agreement on what they'd like to see, and then what you suggest they see, and then obviously the formats in which that information will arrive. The analogy I like to use in this instance is I was, when we were moving into the house I'm in today, it was 5 years ago. Obviously there's a lot of home apps or sites that you can use. There's Redfin, there's Zillow, there's Truly, there's a bunch of sites. And I started using Redfin at first. And now when I look at, just regular or kind of random real estate listings or whatever, because I still get the tons of emails, I'm not really desensitized. I am desensitized to them in the regard that I don't open all of them. But when I open up a Redfin listing, I know exactly where I'm going on that listing. I look at the price per square foot. I scroll down, I look at the sales history, and there's a couple of other data points I look for. But I literally scroll over everything that I never look at, and I know exactly where on the page, because the page has got basically a template that I've become accustomed to. And don't look past that as far as the context portion of your updates to your customers, or to your clients, I should say. I think that's a big value add too, is that if it's predictable and they know where to look for the information that's most important to them, and that may differ across your different stakeholders that are receiving these updates, it is something that I think will add value over time. Next, I want to make a big plea for automation. I think you want to automate reminders specifically. And I know this sounds simple, but it is important. Adding a reminder to a status update email will almost certainly get overlooked because they're looking at the status update and the email or the reminder may be further down the page. They're going to look for what they're most interested in as far as the status update. They're probably going to gloss over the reminders. Reminders made on a Zoom call have low accountability, right? Even if you do an email follow-up afterwards, we're still in the email problem. So, what I would suggest is to get a robot to do that work and make it programmatic. As opposed to a crappy part of the job that, the project manager doesn't want to do of calling up and reminding the client that, we're waiting on you for an approval, we're waiting on you for feedback on V1, V3, whatever. Automating reminders, and again, it's similar to the first point, making those reminders be very simple and contextual and, I would say almost predictable as far as what information you need to pull out of that reminder quickly, I should say. Is, I think, a really big value add. And over time, clients will appreciate that they know what's being asked of them, because then when they give what is asked of them, they can have a reasonable expectation of when these things will get done. And we'll talk about in a little bit. And lastly, when it comes to kind of communication standards, I would suggest creating transparency in activities that don't overwhelm. So let me clarify that. So what I mean here is to pick the activities where a lot of transparency would be welcome, and not be considered to be too noisy, like we talked about in the previous slide. So you want to just agree on what those things are. And, there are differences. For example, like, comments versus decisions. Perhaps, your client does not want to see or be notified of every comment made on a piece of creative that they're in as part of a workflow, but they do want to see the decisions made by maybe their colleagues on their side of the fence. Milestones versus iterations, right? Did we get past a certain, are we done with a certain version? Did we get a completion, or are we simply, completing a stage within a workflow? Whatever they find, whatever you agree together that is most interesting, I would create transparency. And again, this is involved potentially bringing people into your systems, bringing clients into your systems, which we'll talk about in just a second as well. So that'll be a common thread that we'll kind of talk about a little bit today. We've already brought up systems idea, the idea of automations and automation, or say notifications and automation, as well as transparency. And I think that transparency is best delivered via some sort of access to whatever type of system you're using internally to track progress. So let's move on to now visibility. And I want to make a disclaimer here. I am not advocating for your clients or colleagues, if you work within a brand, I'm not advocating for them to go full native within your processes and team. That would just, obviously that's probably a non-starter for the vast majority of us on the call. But I think there is a balance that needs to be struck where you provide info to your clients or stakeholders that demonstrates value, but doesn't distract them with how the value is being created, meaning your creative and internal processes. So what does that come down to? And I think more plainly stated, it's how you provide visibility that is both useful and informative, because there is a difference. You have to really think about information, right? Not all information is informative. How do you provide that information, that visibility, that doesn't also create a host of new questions that could slow down the process? And some classic examples were shared with us as part of our aforementioned survey that we ran earlier this year. This says V3. Where are Vs 1 and 2? Did we pay for those too? That actually came up in a lot of different flavors and kind of a lot of different permutations. That was one of the pieces of, I would say, ambiguity that would come back from clients most often that our customers shared with us as part of our survey. Have enough time to get this through legal approvals. So, depending on where a piece of creative prepared at the stage, if they weren't necessarily familiar with the workflow, and this is very true for, for the brand people on the call today, those who work within the confines of a company, and they also have legal compliance reviews. Do we have enough time to get this through approvals? Because they're not necessarily, they may have seen that, we've reached a stage in the workflow, but they can't see the entire workflow. So they don't know that maybe legal has been reviewing this in parallel. They may assume it's a serial review. And then, the good old classic, when is the second round of creative due? Now that I've given you my feedback, when do I get the next version? So as you probably experienced, each of these questions was typically driven by either a lack of consistent information, which we talked about earlier, but also setting expectations with that information as to what we're expecting from you, Mr. Client or Mr. Stakeholder within the organization. So let's talk about some tactics to drive greater satisfaction through visibility. So this one's going to take a little bit of maybe thought work on your side, but I want to see how well I can convey this. I think a really big value add here, and something that your clients and stakeholders really appreciate, is the idea of non-managed updates via something as simple as dashboards. What I mean by non-managed in this context, it means the information that they can glean via a dashboard or some type of status page in certain types of applications. And this is something that they can check on their own at their own convenience and doesn't require additional action from your side, from the creative project team. And this just doesn't have to mean, on target or late, those types of views either. It can also be where something is in the workflow, like I discussed just a moment ago, what would maybe assuage any, concerns about not being able to get through a legal review. So this is what I mean by non-managed really is it doesn't necessarily mean, me sending an email of like, hey, here's where we are. It's Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. You weren't expecting an email from me at Tuesday at 2 o'clock, but, I want to give you the status update. Non-managed updates via dashboards, there's obviously a level of transparency, which is great. But it's also a level of comfort that, whoever, is your customer, and that could be internal or external, can go and find out a level of information on their own when they want to. The next one is a biggie, and we could probably do an entire presentation on just this one simple bullet, honestly. It's the idea to integrate with their systems. And by that, I mean sending relevant project or status data to their maybe project management app, for example. And what that allows you to do is that allows you to keep a wider audience enabled if they need it. And there's a lot to be said about the tech stacks that agencies are building, but there's a growing number of agencies and brands that we talk to and that we work with on a daily basis that send certain project info outside of their walls to their client systems. And again, this is another example of non-managed updates, sending certain milestones, agreed upon milestones or agreed upon update types outside of their project management suite into another project management suite. And that's really the beauty of modern SaaS applications, is that open APIs really make this available and, knock on wood, actually kind of easy. And it's something that we're seeing a larger growing constituency. I think we first saw this with just sending simple updates to, another organization's Slack or Microsoft Teams. And it's grown to be it's actually driving activity in project management apps. So I think that's an important one. Like I said, we probably do an entire discussion just around, what types of information and what kind of, agreement you could get with your clients to send data to your client project management apps. The last point I'll make here is the idea of standardize but adapt, and that kind of goes back to the Redfin example that I made up earlier. Is I think it's really important to provide consistent methods, but then regularly discuss modifications to that data or the information or even the format that's being reported. If Redfin were ever to ask me, I would probably suggest 12 things they could take off their page template to make it easier for me to look at. Or even better, if they offer customized pages, I would use that in a heartbeat. So think about that as well. Think about what you can standardize, but then also adapt and make a little bit modular over time. But I think that consistency makes it easy for people to consume information, and it makes them feel like they are getting a level of visibility that I really do feel will contribute to their overall customer satisfaction and happiness. All right, we're covering a lot here. So if I'm going too fast, and I tend to talk quickly about things I get all geeked up about, so please do use the Q&A function if you need any clarifying questions. So let's get into response and resolution tactics. The response time side of this story gets the most play. And I think that's because there's definitely an aspect of we strive for customer excellence on the agency side and the I want it now mentality on the client side. So if your response time skews toward the right side of the graph here on the screen, more so than the left, there are definitely things you can do. And we're going to talk about resolution as well, but I think they're very closely intertwined. So let's jump right into like tactics for, improving this aspect of the relationship. And I think there are three things that will deliver the most bang for the buck when it comes to cutting down on response time and issue resolution over time. And I think this is definitely one of the aspects where there's a time span involved in improving an overall customer satisfaction. So, if you had to prioritize something, I would start with this because it'll have compounding benefits down the line. So first, I would, where possible, and depending on what technology you leverage, and there's tons of technologies that you could leverage for this, is automate new project kickoff. Accept a new client brief via web form, kick off a workflow so that the team for that client gets notified, set up your new project file tree automatically. Once that file has been dropped into, a hot folder or a watch folder. That's an example that we're familiar with here at Ziflow, but there are other ways to automate new project intake, maybe even simply with just Dropbox. Think about the last app you tried out or a mailing list you joined. This is, I think, probably the way to make this more real. You probably got a transactional email right away, right? That welcomed you, that thanked you for signing up, that told you what was, coming next, what was to be expected. It's a high leverage way to really just make a connection, but it's also just a high leverage way to get the project going and also let the client know, hey, we're starting our process. Thank you. We've accepted or we've acknowledged that you sent something in, and we're going to start something. We're going to start working on it on our side. The cool thing here is that for automated intake forms, in many instances, is that you can require certain information. So if you're going to go a step beyond just like, putting out a Dropbox folder out there, putting, maybe a web form on top of that folder, you can require certain information. So you don't have to worry about, no context briefs or images being shared and leaving you to figure out what the heck it all means. You can actually require some information. That's not really a product pitch, but if you'd like to learn more about that, you can reach out to me after today's call because we can help out with that today as well. Next is auditing. And I think this is all about bi-directional accountability, right? Accountability both ways. Being able to provide an audit, just talking about the creative review and approval process at this point, who opened what, when, who was delivered what file when, who made which comments when, and which decisions. From a client side, for an agency side, it's a great way to, show new employees, to initiate new processes that show, look, this is a really good, look at this client project. It was delivered ahead of schedule, on budget, and there was, high degrees of satisfaction. Let's go back and look at actually how it was executed, right? Like we got the brief on this day. Everyone got V1, 2 days later. We got the first round of feedback within 24 hours. We got a decision made within 48 hours. We made one V2, and then we got decision made, 24 hours after that. Everyone did their part. Everyone did their role. So it's a great learning experience on the client side, but then, on the agency side, but then on the client side, you can demonstrate, the visibility and the response time, but also you can also demonstrate where they may be, actually slowing your processes down, because, you can show that, in some cases that a piece of creative was delivered or sent on a Monday, but never even got opened until a Thursday. That may obviously provide you with leverage to move some timelines, but also can show you, hey, this is a relationship and we need to, both do our part. So auditing project activity, and then in some cases exposing that audit trail, can be a useful. It definitely sounds like getting out of comfort zones, and it is, but it can definitely be useful to the overall, I would say, health of the relationship. And then once again, I'm going to make a pitch here for providing access to systems they influence and affect. So I talked earlier about integrating with your client systems. This is the idea of giving them access via a dashboard to see exactly, where things are in the process, but also it's a great, tying it back to the audit trail. it's a great way to show how timelines are shifting because of either inaction on the client side, or maybe it's something that drove out of scope. And if you have shared resources, you can actually show how it downstream affects your other business. So I know this might sound a little scary. This is a big one that I think a lot of our clients anyway have embraced to try and drive greater client satisfaction. And it definitely kind of spans the things that we talked about today. It spans visibility, it spans communication, and it's definitely about response time as well. It just demonstrates a greater response time. And I think automation. I think a lot of people are embracing automation today, and I don't think that's a big problem. Audit trails, it's a little, like I said, it's a little bit out of comfort zone for a lot of people, and providing access to your systems, it's a little out of comfort zone for some people. But I can tell you, it's been our experience at Ziflow that, for the agencies that we work with, that these are areas that are driving high satisfaction, or increasing, I should say, the satisfaction. All right, let's move on. Wow. That was a lot. As Caroline said, we want to try and get you out of here in 25 minutes, and we're going to move into Q&A. What I wanted to do now is I just want to, well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for hanging out, but I want to look at some key takeaways from today's presentation. And as Caroline mentioned, the presentation is available for you for download. Definitely, if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us at Ziflow. I'll put our contact information on the next slide. The key takeaways from today, obviously communication standards. The big one is you want to agree on expectations for cadence and context of your regular updates. Get the client involved, get your stakeholders involved if you're at a brand, and just get them to agree, with you what the cadence is going to be and the context for those updates. Where you can, I would definitely embrace automation for the day-to-day updates and information. Within reason, obviously, you don't want to create that, head explosion icon or emoji, but there definitely is some value to automating that. And then you also definitely want to differentiate between status updates and milestones for your updates. Again, this is like bubbling the real true information, the important information up to the top. For client and project visibility, if you can, provide non-managed updates where possible. Let a robot do some of the work. Let a dashboard do some of the work, like we just talked about in response time and resolution. If you, can get that comfort level, if you feel like the client can embrace that dashboard in the right way, or not necessarily use it against you, I think it's a really powerful tool. Integrate with their systems if that's an option. Again, now going back again, talking a little bit out of comfort zones, this is a really powerful way to keep them up to date in a way that they're comfortable with. I've done other presentations where one of the key themes is making it easy to work with team members and collaborate, especially when we went to a remote working situation. You always want to try and make it easy and make your colleagues, be it internal or external, comfortable to work in the systems that they are comfortable with. And like I said that before, that's the beauty of modern SaaS applications is open APIs. A lot of times that information is able to be sent fairly easily. And the last point around client project visibility definitely is to standardize, but adapt to new information requirements. So make a regular check-in and make sure that hey, is the format working for you? Is the cadence still acceptable? Do we need to slow it down? Do we need to accelerate it? Things like that. I mean, I think that's just a good regular practice. Is not only are you making sure that the client is getting what they need from a creative perspective, but also they're getting it from like an update and predictability standpoint. Last but not least, response and resolution. If you can, automate new project kickoff. Like I said, think back to the last app or mailing list that you signed up that you had a really good experience with as far as, what's coming next, thanking them for, your information and, setting an expectation about, how this was going to go. That's a little bit of like, you can definitely borrow some consumer attributes of how those, kind of back and forth goes, but automating that kickoff, I think is a really big value add. Auditing project activity and what to learn from it, especially, like I said, if the client is affecting results negatively, the audit trail is definitely a huge tool in your bag there. And then like I said, get comfortable with providing access to the systems that indicate a project's momentum. Those are almost always going to be your systems. So if you can, try and get comfortable with, giving them access to that. Some common themes, as you can see, I mean, automation and technology, but not email. Those are the common themes I'd say across, I'd say across all three of these silos. And as luck would have it, I work for a technology company that does provide a level of automation for creative teams. How is that for a non-pitch segue? Before we jump into Q&A, I just want to give you 20 seconds on Ziflow. Ziflow is the industry's leading online proofing solution. Brands and agencies, the world's biggest brands and agencies worldwide use Ziflow every day for their review and approval processes to get more work over the finish line with extreme customer satisfaction. We do this by making the feedback process effortless, getting teams better aligned, and reducing all the overhead required to get projects reviewed and approved for brands and agencies. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit www.ziflow.com. We're always there, and we'd be happy to show you how we can help your creative team get more great work done every day. All right, now for the fun part. I'm going to go ahead and throw it back over to Caroline for the Q&A.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike. That was a lot of awesome information there. So like Mike said, we're going to start Q&A now. So if you do have a question, please ask it using the question tool on the left side of your screen. If we don't get to your question, we'll make sure it gets forwarded over so that Mike and his team can answer it offline. All right. So you mentioned integrating with client systems or giving them access to your systems. Which systems are the most popular or provide the most value?
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, I think initially we saw the instantaneous updates to Slack and Microsoft Teams as being like the most powerful or the most popular. But I think as people realize like what types of information can be gleaned from a system like an online proofing system, project management, I would say by far and away is the probably the most popular. Those project management systems, in use today, like, Asana or Monday.com or ClickUp or Trello, they're pretty well customized to do the user's view and requirements. So being able to plug into that view, and that really does speak to the theme I talked about before, which is make it easier to collaborate with people by using systems that they're most comfortable with. So I would say project management is definitely one. Digital asset management has been another one that we've seen for sending like finished product to make it easier for them to achieve. But I think project management closely followed by like the instant communication apps like Teams and Slack, probably being a close second for sure.
Awesome. Thanks so much. That's super helpful. This question is pretty straightforward. What do you use for automation?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is kind of straightforward in the fact that what we use for automation is Ziflow. Ziflow is an interesting company to work for because it is one of those companies where you use your own product every day. I shared these slides via Ziflow with my content team to get their approval before we went live. So we use it in terms, so it's got an automation engine that will not only handles workflow, but also potentially even routing of files from like the automated intake form example I used. That's definitely kind of like an issue or an example that we're very familiar with. Our technology allows you to create an overlay over like Google Drive and Dropbox, where you can drop a file via an intake form, a web-based form, and marry that up with a workflow on the back end. So that's our own technology. But we also have we use Zapier here and there within Ziflow as well. But as far as like kind of the automation of routing and notifications and stuff, that's all the experience I have, and that that came from our survey as well. Is all basically based on Ziflow.
Awesome, good answer.
Yeah.
Awesome. So in your experience, what part of the agency client process provides the most insights to a client to get them to understand timelines and impact to timeline?
Ooh. Yeah, that's a good question. That's it's, I talked about, getting out of comfort zones and whatnot. I think the example that I had before about, when, you want to give visibility, right? But you don't want to create more questions, or you don't want to open up basically a can of worms by providing them with so much information that they don't have context about what you're really trying to tell them. And I think the one thing that if you could describe and expose to a client would be the workflow, like literally what the workflow looks like. It's going to go from our design team to our copy team to our project to our account team. Then we're going to send it to you, and then we're going to have you send it to your legal team. I think exposing the workflow probably has the single biggest impact. And showing, and again, it's not just like showing like a Visio diagram or a mock-up of what the workflow looks like, but also where things sit in the workflow and knowing what just got done and what's coming next, in addition to where things sit. So this is a combination of them just understanding that you do have a workflow, but also, again, it's kind of the context discussion that I brought up earlier. Showing them in a context of like a dashboard. If you can be that comfortable to share a dashboard with your client, showing them where in the workflow, your project sits as part of that dashboard, I think is super powerful, and honestly would answer more questions than it would create, because it's a level of comfort that something's A, being worked on, B, it's at the right stage, and C, what's coming next. I think if you just gave those basic parameters to a client, there's a level of comfort that maybe they wouldn't have had before. So yeah, definitely say workflow.
Definitely, yeah. We deal with that on our end here too. That makes a good point. Awesome. So we are going to leave it there for today. I want to thank you, Mike, so much for being with us and all of our audience. Like I said, if you want a copy of the slides today, go to that event resources tab, and we'll be emailing out a link to the on-demand presentation later this afternoon. So thank you so much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you on an upcoming Adweek webinar.
Thanks, everybody.